Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. In this episode, I'm joined once again by Ashish Malhotra, one of the sharpest minds in commercial property investing. Now, if you've ever wondered what really separates residential from commercial property, this one's for you. Ashish breaks down where the competition is fiercest and why the 2 to 5 million range is what he calls the Goldilocks zone, and the traps investors fall into when they chase yields without understanding the risks. We also dig into capital growth misconceptions, vacancy risks, and how to really assess a deal beyond the headline numbers. Whether you're a residential investor thinking about making the leap, or you're already in commercial and looking for your next big move, this conversation will give you practical insights and a reality check on where the opportunities lie. Let's jump in. Ashish Malhotra, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a little while.
It has been a while. We've had a couple of laps around the sun since we last spoke, and we were focusing a little bit more on the residential side of things. But the sort of scope for this episode is focusing in on the competition. I suppose commercial is competition, but focusing on commercial property. Now, the reason why I made the Freudian slip of competition is because I'm thinking about the competition in my next question. So when we talk about residential versus commercial, there's also price points as competing areas that we can play. And when we talk about competition in buying residential property, there's so much communication in that sort of 550 to 650 or lower price point. And I wanted to ask you the question, is there a similar point where every sort of mum and dad first time commercial property investor are fighting it out at a particular price point where perhaps it's worth thinking about some of those higher price points to get a good value deal?
Look, what I've seen is I think we started buying commercial properties for mom and dad investors. So the price points around that 600 to 800K mark. But the competition is so fierce with mom and dad investors trying to jump into higher yields, especially since the interest rates have gone high. And from there, SMSF investors, doctors, lawyers, cafe and restaurant owners trying to get their own premises done. The yields have dropped to somewhere around 5 to 5.5%, and in really well-placed properties and smaller shops with some decent tenants, Subway, for example, the yields sometimes drop to 4.5 and 5%. So then people doesn't start to um, it doesn't gives us a lot of differentiation there because you need a higher deposit. You're still accepting lower yields. And then
Yes.
a lot of investors have a notion that the prices won't go up in commercial because they're directly uh, kind of related or directly proportional to the yields that the properties are fetching. So ideally, you're not making much of a difference from resi versus commercial. So, and most investors, so that discourages the investors at times. However, the moment we go beyond that 1.5 to 2 million range, you start to see better tenants. I like to call that as a Goldilocks zone where the assets provide a professional grade tenant. They You get quality businesses like medical, childcare, logistics, and you're not directly competing with REIT syndicates and family offices or institutional investors who will jump with all their guns at that $10 million range or beyond
Yes.
$5 million range. And these guys are very well placed to place the offers and accept lower yields as well. So that's where I think this 2 to 5 million range works really well. The finance is accessible, the LVRs are stackable, and there's sometimes price inefficiencies that can be exploited because there's less competition. It's not your ideal mom and dad sort of property, but it's also not the syndicate sort of property. So um, there's still a potential of multi-tenanted precincts. So yeah, just I really would say that $2 to $5 million becomes a Goldilocks zone. Anywhere up to 1.5 million, you're still looking at strata warehouses or retail shops, which
Yep.
means that's for a smaller investor um, who has maybe multiple properties or a decent cash flow, but they don't have the deposit to go to that $2 million range.
Yeah. When you were talking about the residential versus commercial, with the idea that commercial is attractive to residential investors because of the yield, but then their expectation is that commercial property won't have capital growth, or at least if it is, it's always indexed to kind of an increase in the rent. It kind of begs the question. I suppose a big difference between resi and commercials, when we talk about the return, we're talking net in commercial versus gross in residential. But do you think the residential investor is going, okay, well, maybe I don't understand that at all, or I do understand that, but it's the capital growth that in the end makes them kind of line by line?
Look, first of all, the problem is a higher deposit in commercial. And I
Right.
believe that is the biggest barrier. And a good differentiation between a residential property and a commercial property, where residential property you can jump in with about 15 to 17% deposit, including LMI capitalized. But in commercial, you're looking at 25 to 35% deposit and additional costs like structural inspections in some cases, um, valuations. Bank will charge anywhere between 1 to 2% in mortgage approvals and costs at times. So coming to the growth aspect, I believe there's a misconception that the commercial properties won't grow in value.
Mm.
And even if I take the smaller purchases in consideration, which is less than $1 million, in areas like Perth, in areas like South Australia, in Southeast Queensland, even Sydney, Central Coast, example for that matter, these properties have grown really well and in line with residential precincts or residential areas or properties. Um, Another example is Norwest, where I'm sitting at the moment. Now,
Yep.
back in 2014, um, you could have got an office space around that 4,200 per square meter mark. So today in newer office, and I'm talking a new building around Brook
Yep.
Hollow Avenue in Norwest, which most people would know of. Today, these properties are selling anywhere between 12.5 to 13,500 a square meter. So while
Wow.
in last 10 years, properties around Bella Vista, Castle Hill, Walkham Hills have about doubled in value, the office spaces have tripled in value.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
we've bought some properties in 2022 and 2023 in Perth and Queensland. Now, while these areas were really growing for investors, these commercial properties have also grown to nearly giving 40 to 60% returns in capital growth. And at the same time, we've seen 35% increases in rentals. So while in today's yields, they might be sitting at 5.5 to 6%, but on the buy price, we're looking at almost 8 to 9% net yields.
There
And
you go.
then comes your aspect of net. A lot of investors chase that 0.5% additional yields in residential, jumping into Townsville and other markets without realizing that the council charges, the water charges, actually the council and insurance doubles almost, as opposed to certain metro precincts, and the water charge is almost you're paying 50% more, and that's your extra 0.5% to almost 0.7% yield that you've got, which you pay in costs.
Mm.
And in commercial, even if I have achieved about 5.5% net yield, that's equivalent to 6.5 to 7% gross in a residential. So it
Mm.
still makes sense. It's also, you're not incurring any costs, more importantly. Um, while buying, now this is very important because a lot of investors don't take into account what they would have to pay in costs, be it residential or commercial. If after buying you realize that you're paying certain portion of the contribution that otherwise the tenant would have paid, your yield's pretty much gone. So you have
Yeah.
to be very cautious and careful as to what a landlord's outgoings would be. I hope I was able to answer all the questions. I believe there are a
Yeah,
couple of
no,
questions in the statement.
no, I know, and that's part of my interview style, which is terrible. And but I've come this far. I'm not going to stop. Ashish, I wanted to ask, and you touched on this a moment ago. So, other than the competition at price points, so for example, if you're looking at a commercial property at 600 or 700, 800,000, you're going to have a lot more people involved there. If we go to $1.5 million, 2 mil, 5 mil, there's going to be less people able to purchase something like that. But we're also talking about the quality of asset being different. Now, you did mention multiple tenancies, so I wonder if you could sort of contrast what typically a $700,000 commercial property buy would be compared to say, I suppose you're saying 1.5 and up is that Goldilocks zone. What are we getting at 1.5 that we're not getting at 700?
Look, I not even consider 1.5. I'd consider $2 million as a
Right.
Goldilocks zone to about $5 million. So when we're talking 700 to 1.5 mil, you're still buying those strata warehouses or strata retail shops where your businesses can be your local ice cream parlors, takeaway shops, smaller medical precincts at times, small doctors who won't buy their own precinct. You're looking at Subways, you're looking at Pizza Huts as well, Hungry Jacks at times, office spaces, you're looking at owner occupier, and there's a trend where most of the businesses are, again, I get to know that their accountant has advised them to buy their own premises under their super, which I think the super allows your business to rent the premises. Of course, it's an arm's length transaction. And I see a lot of owner occupiers, smaller businesses who would like to get their own spaces. I've supported an auto parts manufacturer who just who has a warehouse, who has a factory, and he needed a warehouse in Ingleburn in New South Wales. Similarly, a vegan catering owner who wanted to have a premises, and he was struggling to source something in the market for 6 months. And apparently, he went to a big name brand as in a buyer's agent, and they refused, and they won't secure anything for less than $1.5 million. And again, look, I think it's just a budget. We engaged a town planner straight away. We understood we found the property which came under liquidator auction, and that's what we're talking, anywhere between 550 to about $900. When we go around that 1.5 million mark, sometimes we're buying quality. For example, we bought a warehouse in Arundel in Gold Coast, and occupied by a national beverage company on a 9-year lease. They spent like $50,000 in fit outs, another 30,000 in putting a freezer in. So they were vested in trust. At 1.5 million, we were still able to achieve a six, actually five, it was under rented. The yield was 5.7%, but due to COVID, there was an increase of 7% plus another 5% on top. So yes, we did accept it at a slightly lower yield, but immediately the yield went to around that 6.05% mark. Today it's been like 4 years. They've renewed for the second tenure as well. So it's a 3 plus 3 plus 3 year tenure. But because they have a vested interest, we have to understand what they've spent in the premises as well. And this was a fairly new premises, and I don't have to tell you that commercial properties have slightly higher depreciation. Am I right in saying that?
Well, the big differential between commercial and resi is that on the 9th of May 2017, the plant and equipment was taken away from anything that's not brand new in resi, but that rule didn't apply to commercial. So just in that alone, there's quite a lot. It means you'll be able to claim secondhand plant and equipment. But often with commercial, there's a lesser land component to building value. If you think about a warehouse, you're kind of building to the whole size of the block. Whereas if you're buying a house, it might be a 200 square meter house on a 600 square meter block. So yeah, I don't like to make generic statements, but yeah, a lot of the time commercial can be better.
And this warehouse was only 1 year old. So I think that was a very good deal. But this is again what we're talking around 1.5-ish mil. Now, the moment we go beyond 2 mil, we start to see childcares, we start to see medical leases, we start to look at other quality tenants like again, I'm going $2 to $5 million now, but let's say JBL's, I won't say Bunnings, but super cheap autos,
Yep.
other cafes, bigger cafes, small medical precincts, GP precincts. We look at pathologies. Um, then recently, I'm actually doing a development, which I know is a separate conversation, but we've been talking to retailers like JB Hi-Fi. We are talking to retailers like Starbucks. We're talking to bulky goods retail. Harvey Norman has just said no because they are looking for a bigger precinct. So we've got about 2,500 square meter covered area.
Right.
And despite that, the beauty is if we can secure a tenant, we are expecting a lease of $625,000 a year, which takes the valuation to nearly $10 million. And because we are developing, we'll end up walking. Um, so we'll finish the purchase and the build around that 6.5-ish
Yeah.
million
Wow.
mark. So there's ample fat in the deal doing developments. So, but having said that, that $10 million, we are expecting a 15 to 20-year lease, anywhere between 1 and 3 tenants. And because it has exposure to a major highway, the foot traffic is amazing. Now, the beauty is there's a huge difference between exposure to highway and direct access from highway. So,
Right.
and there's a Bunnings right across this property. So the Bunnings has a direct access to highway, and right next to Bunnings, you find a liquor store, super cheap auto, swim school. You have a cafe there. There's a tire manufacturing, not manufacturing, but tire company like Bridgestone. And then
Yep.
across the road, there's an alley, there's Woolworths. Coles has bought some space across the road. Toyota has announced their precinct. There's a Snap Fitness there. So these gyms also is a very good and lucrative business. So these are the sort of tenants you start to see in those $2 to $5 million mark. And sometimes your risks are diversified by having multiple tenants in those precincts. You
Mm.
can achieve that into smaller precincts as well, but the problem is your WALE drops, your weighted average lease expiry, or WALE, and that
Yes.
drops with a cheaper precinct or a smaller tenants because a smaller tenant is only in a position to take either a periodic lease or anywhere between 2 or 3 year lease, while the bigger tenants that I work with, say for example, your community entertainment and um, th- places like indoor badminton courts, because
Yeah.
they're spending 250 to $500,000 into fit outs, it makes sense for them to have a 7 to 10 year leases plus similar options.
Mm. I
So
was going to ask you a question about that
yeah.
because you mentioned before getting an insight into what I would call the sunk cost that a tenant has put into the building. Can that be a bit of a strategy when you're looking at a potential commercial acquisition where you can kind of see that this tenant has fit this out at a huge expense, so they're very unlikely to walk away unless they're bankrupt or something like that?
And this is where you start to see the background of the tenant as well, as to
Mm.
what they've been doing so far. A lot of landlords are hesitant to let their premises to someone who has no experience in the past. So it's
Mm.
not easy. I was working with an Indian cultural organization, and they wanted a premises, and I have struggled to source a premises for them. So, and
Right.
I have no doubt in another 1 or 2 years, they'd be in a position to buy their own premises. But when we do lease negotiations, this is what people don't take into account, like make good clauses. It's not just putting those fit outs in, it's also then to ensure when they are moving out, they're keeping the premises in the same condition as to when they occupied the premises. which is
Yeah.
definitely in the benefit of the landlord, but it adds costs to tenants. Someone who's spending 250 to $500,000 into a premises just to make sure their business is afloat and they're maintaining that quality, it becomes tenants' responsibility first of all. But then they also have a vested interest to research the demographic a bit, to research how far is the similar premises, to research what sort of footfall would be there, right? And this is where the tenant has a vested interest along with the landlord. But ideally,
Yes.
the landlord's taking the benefits of longer leases. Now, there is a chance you can well negotiate the rent-free terms. And sometimes a negotiation for longer leases as well. For example, if you're taking 7 to 10 year lease, we can actually ask for anywhere between 3 to 6 month rent-free period. And that rent-free period is generally the time when you start to take DAs or CDCs and start to get the fit outs done on the premises.
Yep.
So now this is where the lease negotiation comes in as well, because even if you can negotiate, let's say $20,000 yearly rent, over next 7 or 10 years, we're talking 140 to $200,000 in savings without adding compounding to it. And I think
Mm.
people don't realize at times that the small savings can actually turn out really big. Um, I was doing a lease negotiation, which was about 500,000 a year, and we actually could knock off about $40,000 just by showcasing that the nearby precincts were inferior. Tenants were not doing as many modifications, and they were still renting a bit cheaper. So
Yeah. Right.
these guys
Yeah.
didn't realize, because, and that's the thing, Mike. When we look at a premises, there's a per square meter sale price, there's a per square meter rental price, and then there's the ongoing cap rate of the area. And between one area or the second area, you actually would see sometimes a difference in the cap rate. So it doesn't matter if that area, the ideal cap rate is running at 6%. If in the area you are in and it's an older precinct and the cap rate drops to 5.5%, there's no way. Sometimes that can be used as a negotiation tactic as well.
Mm.
But again, just back over to you. I think I was able to answer the question that you
Oh
asked.
yeah, no, absolutely, and it is quite fascinating, isn't it? I was thinking of a parallel. We did a construction estimate for a builder that was going for a fit out job, and so we helped them to cost out the works and go to tender. And we ended up sending the invoice, and they said, "Well, we didn't get the job." So as if to say, well, we're not going to pay for the work that you did. And I thought, isn't that an interesting thing? Like, if that was the setup, I'd want to be in the interview. I'd want to be pitching with them for the business, right? We can't just sort of throw it up in the air to say, well, good luck with that. I hope you win
Yeah.
it so that we get paid. It's a crazy sort of notion, but there's sort of like a parallel with commercial investing. I mean, you do have an interest in the success of the business in a way that is not as important as the tenant. Of course, if a tenant has financial difficulties and they're not able to pay the rent and you need to replace them with someone else, there's arguably a lot more people to take their place at short notice than, say, in a commercial premises. Because, I mean, that's one of the big complaints or worries that investors in commercial properties have, is those vacancy periods, right? So the more you can understand about the tenant, their expectations, their willingness to spend money within that location, you can kind of get a bit of an idea about the levels of sophistication, right?
Spot on. And since you've talked vacancies, and I've seen an example, one of our client, I was telling you about the birth property, and their property, they got a notice in March this year that the tenant would be vacating in June, and the demand is so high that the tenant actually moved out on 27th of June, and 1st of July the new lease was signed.
Oh, wow.
Um, Even talking around Sydney, office spaces, ground floor, where on 100 square meter you're paying nearly 110,000 rent a year. A place got empty because the tenants there, and I was a sublease there for my office space, And afterwards, I thought I'll rather buy my own office. So I was a sublease, and they were going under. So they had to rather break the lease, and then they had to pay for the agent to advertise for that property. It just took 4 months for the property to rent out, and
Mm.
with a very big real estate and insurance provider. But my point being, it's a very similar example in not actually in Gold Coast, it's in North Lakes. There's a precinct there. There's a big commercial precinct. The property got empty, and because there's 3 months notice pretty much, generally, then this very second week of, even without going to the market, there was an application, the guy was ready to occupy the premises. And I think this is where the competition goes up and the yields drop, because the smaller commercial are actually, the vacancies are dropping, just very similar to residential. But the problem is when investors try to chase high yields, um, those 7 to 9% yields, which I get a lot of requests, are only available in regionals.
Right.
And the problem with regionals is they're not big precincts, they're not supported by multiple economic factors. And once the property is empty, and that's where the buyers would start to bear the brunt, because
Mm.
you're looking at 6 months to 12 months worth of vacancies. And we don't have to go far to Townsville, Mackay, or any of the other areas. Not that anything wrong with those areas. I looked at Lithgow.
Yep.
There's a 10-year lease with Subway, and half of the shop is empty. And the seller is actually willing to give a 2-year rental guarantee on the empty space. Now, we chose not to buy there. And it's been a year, the shop is still empty, and it has not been sold.
Mm.
And Lithgow is not that far. But the thing is, it's not a major precinct. I
Yes.
rather would go to Orange and Dubbo, and I see much more commercial activity in those precincts than Lithgow. So, and I think I'm not even 2 hours from Sydney, but that's the problem with commercial premises.
Mm.
But anyway, there's a lot to add, but to your point, and then that's the beauty of bigger leases. And that's also a problem going beyond $5 million, because of 20, 25, 30-year leases. We know that at 3 or 3.5%, those rentals are going to double within that period.
Yep.
And some of the Bunnings or some of the McDonald's or Hungry Jacks with high land holdings, and that's where those REITs or family offices or institutional investors jump in. They're expecting yields of 3.5 to 4.5%, and you
Right.
can't compete with those sort of investors. And
Mm.
sometimes I see within, especially that 3.5-ish million mark, you're able to achieve sometimes 7% yields. Sometimes the properties are under rented. And the smaller the precinct goes, or the smaller the shops go, the lower the whale gets.
Right.
So ideally, that's why I don't want, even personally, I don't want 20 warehouses into one precinct unless I'm developing it.
Yeah.
I just want anywhere between 1 and 3 tenants leasing it. And these are big tenants. Reese Plumbing, for example, fantastic furniture. These are amazing tenants with established repo. They have multiple precincts. And the only way these would go down is, God forbid, when if they go under. But then that's
Yes.
also a highly unlikely scenario. But that's where the differences are, and I think one should understand the costs associated. Um, I had an investor talking to me. He said, Ashish, I'm looking at a $7 million asset. And I said, wow, okay, that's good because we can get a very, very decent precinct. And a week after he calls and he said, I've just bought it. And I said, my God, like a week back, we were talking on buying. Did you had an idea? Were you looking at anything? He said, no. I just went to an auction and I just bought something. And I said,
Goodness me.
I'm sorry, help me understand a bit what due diligence you did. Because 7 days for such a big precinct is even a tough challenge for us. So he said, oh, there were 8 bidders. I'm sure someone would have done something. So
Oh no.
like such big precincts, I would have looked at a structural inspection. I would have looked at least doing. a due diligence on the tenants, the arrears, looking at if there was any building sinking funds, or any issues with the building, if there was strata associated. Like there's so much needed on leases, tenants, zoning, potential, like just
That's
financials.
insane. That's absolutely insane. It's like showing up late to a Russian roulette game and not knowing how many times the trigger's been pulled before they showed up.
I don't know how people think, to be honest. The $7 million, I would just, excuse my French, but shit my pants.
I know. I'll allow it. What I can only hope is this person has $700 million of net worth, and it was just a little whim. If that's all of the eggs from their basket gone, I mean that's a horrifying thing. I,
You know
I
what?
hope you.
They have about $4 to $5 million in residential assets, and without revealing too much, he has a very decent business, but the business
Right.
valuation might have been 12 to 15 million. So I won't say spending 7 million in an asset. Um, the net worth would have stayed 700 million, but
Mm,
maybe 14, 15 million. And considering they are investing half of the net worth into a property, look, I would be really scared. And that's the beauty. Like sometimes people ask, "Are you scared?" And I said, "Yes." And you should be
mm,
dealing with someone who's scared, because they will do that extra edge and due diligence to make sure they have done everything in their power to make sure we're not making a mistake.
I've heard
Um,
people use the analogy before. We spend more time researching our newest TV purchase or the hotel that we're going to stay at on holidays than sometimes our investment. And in that example, I think both of those things would qualify. I would bet that person looked up a little bit more information about the last TV they bought than the actual $7 million property.
And I look, I've seen so many issues where, on the surface the deals are amazing with 7 to 8% return. There's an area called the Gap in Queensland, and we got something where it was flagged as a distressed off-market sale, returning 8% net returns. And on the surface, the deal looks amazing. It was split. It was a shopping center split into 13 tenants, with the anchor tenant occupying about, 30% of the space on a 5-year lease, and rest all leases were less than 2 or 3 years, with 5 shops being empty. And there was a rental guarantee added in order to bring that yield up to the 8%. So
Right.
I just can't imagine why someone would buy with 5 empty shops, even if there is a rental guarantee. And that's the problem of splitting the precinct into really small shops. And then after realizing that there's a huge precinct just within 5 minutes distance from there, I didn't see any value in um, buying that precinct for the client. And again, that's where the due diligence comes in. Um,
Mm.
as opposed to Mike, I've seen a shop and I bought for a very dear friend of mine for $370,000,
Yeah.
um, in a precinct of 5 shops, about an hour from Gold Coast or 2 hours from Brisbane. I
Yep.
was there at 11 o'clock. There were 22 parking spaces and 16 were full, and the precinct was open for only half an hour.
Right.
After realizing there was an LD in the front, a Service New South Wales office. Sorry, this is a Service, not New South Wales, but Service
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Queensland on one side, and then Council building on the other. Super Cheap Auto on the left. This precinct was a bit raised. It was a corner shop that could have been split into two. A precinct of 5 shops only, and no shop remains vacant for more than 2 or 3 months. Um, it was a brand new lease, and this guy had the experience of running Pizza Huts even in his past role. So he just moved a location from one to another because he wanted to move closer to family.
Yep.
Asking about the financials, he had no hesitations in sharing the financials for last year or two. Um, it's been 4 years now. The Actually, the property has gone up in value, at a decent price point. The yields at that point was 6.2%. The outgoings were a bit high, but there was like literally $400,000 in the sinking fund of that building, which was really
Right.
safe. And right now, on the buy price, we're looking at nearly 8.5% yields. There's been a review after 3 years. So
Yeah. Wow.
again, I've just one example. I haven't seen much cheaper properties, but I'm just saying there are
Yep.
sometimes those golden nuggets which, and this was being bought under SMSF, so it doesn't matter. There's still 20% deposit, and I reckon it's stacked up pretty well.
Yeah.
Where I actually traveled there, looked at the foot traffic, looked at the precinct. On the same road, there was a Pizza Hut around a kilometer beyond this shop, so there was
Mhm.
nothing within in that vicinity. But again, I was told there at times in the evenings there's no space to park cars there. People park outside. So, and that's the sort of footfall you saw even in the small town there. So, yeah,
Yeah.
just
Interesting. There can still be good deals at that price point.
it's
Um,
less. It's less.
yeah, sure. That's a bit of a that's a bit of a rare one there.
Yeah.
You mentioned COVID, and COVID obviously changed a lot of things, but the commercial market, I think it changed very disproportionately. There were lots of stories about the mass exodus of companies wanting office space, and I think based on some of the lease terms, it's probably still yet to completely wash through. We're still probably going to see some work from home stuff expand. I'm wondering, post COVID, what are the types of premises that people should be nervous about, and what are the ones that are really popular? For example, after COVID, I witnessed the medical and diversified tenancies, like the homemaker center style thing that has a number of key tenants, maybe with a medical precinct with some established retail, like some of those big name brands that you're talking about. Those things became in demand. What's changed? What's good, and what's the good and the bad and the ugly in terms of commercial right now? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
So first of all, the types of industries that we've seen are medical and allied health. I think
Yep.
this is by far the best and the most stable industry that hasn't changed. 'Cause people needed doctors,
Yeah.
people needed labs, non-discretionary, strong growth, strong leases. Um, Second comes service retail, which has actually increased in demand. Childcares, they didn't stop much.
Yep.
There was a time, but then there was government literally paying the childcares, and most businesses, they were okay. So then food, convenience stores, and the neighborhood centers, there's such sticky demand. Um, Barbers, takeaway shops, like they were still open within COVID, and I just at times people didn't even care. I think after about initially there was a lot of hype. I think that people were more scared than these guys, and then the less resilient ones, discretionary um, retails and
Yep.
gyms, fashion stores, clothing, apparels, and I think the worst hit were office spaces and cafes
Yep.
in CBD precincts. Um, Due to the e-commerce boom, the logistics and warehouses just went literally exploded through the roof, even in
Yep.
regionals, especially around precincts like, for example, Central Coast, Newcastle, anything around M1 was just flying out the door, even bigger warehouses. That's where we saw the demand from even small business owners like plumbers, joinery makers, carpenters, and even small e-commerce businesses who wanted a quick turnaround. They needed small warehouses. It has the demand of those mom and dad warehouses has increased as the houses have gone smaller. Those 30 to 50 square meter warehouses where people can park their boats, their toys. A plumber can have a mezzanine and actually sit in it in their office and still park their boats and caravans in those smaller precincts. They've suddenly gone up, and now it's self-storage, smaller warehouses like 30 to 50 square meters, like even 15 to 30 square meters. I have a plumber who bought a small warehouse in a basement in Seven Hills, New South Wales, for $350,000. And I said, why? He said, oh, look, I can just keep my stuff there. I have pipes. Now he's grown from literally three people to nine people in last 2 3 years, and because of the civil works and all the jobs he's getting, he needs to store somewhere, and I won't be surprised if he needs a bigger warehouse space. Warehousing has become a crazy market. The landlords have the control to say yes or no to a tenant, and there's hardly any vacancies. But what I've seen is the suburban precincts, even the office suburban precincts outside of CBDs, have actually gone up in demand.
Mm.
Norwest, for example, Marston Park, I've been approached by a gym owner and said, we are taking a franchisee and our budget is $30,000 for a small 50 to 80 square meter shop. And when you look at the small neighborhood shopping centers like Kolebi, for example, or the Ponds, I'm talking Sydney now,
Yep.
or even smaller ones in Bochum Hills, Bella Vista, they're charging 60 to $80,000 in rent plus. So, and I told them, do you have the budget of 60? And they said, our franchise model doesn't stack up at that sort of price point. And I said, I don't know
Mm.
how I can help you. A similar franchise was recently taken in Thalawong, and there the rent is $60,000. It's still very reasonable based on the space they have, but I don't know how. So again, just summarizing what the discussion's been, so that demand in CBD has actually gone down, but now it's coming back to some extent. I think it will normalize in next 5 to 8 years. But
Yep.
what we've seen is actually the suburban precincts. People see travel as a waste of time. They want to stay near to their families. They want to stay near to their work locations, and they'll do anything. They'll pay premium to stay next to their work, sorry,
Yep.
home, to stay next to
Yes.
their
Yep.
home. Because look, I'll take my example, and for me, it's a 30-minute trip from starting from home, drop the kids, coming to office, even then go back home.
Yep.
I'm not anything more than 10 15 minutes drive to anywhere. And
Yep.
now my younger one, anyway, that's a separate discussion. But um, so I think reduction in the office spaces, and there's been a huge impact to office spaces as well. And this is where the big buildings have actually lost value.
Yep.
And then when it comes to big buildings, now I'm talking just beyond for 10, 20, 30, $40 million, we start talking about Nebius rating and all of that. And it becomes a very different ball game.
Mm.
But those investors, one, they're institutional investors, they have a bit of risk appetite, but then we ended up hearing a lot of investors going bust. So I don't
Mm.
know. Are you aware of Parkley Markets towards?
Yes.
Yes. So Parkley Markets got sold around 5 years back. I think around 80 to 85 million dollars.
I was involved in that transaction to some extent, actually.
That's good. I
Yeah.
think it was Dildum that bought that.
Yes. Yeah.
It's back on market yesterday.
I didn't know that. There you go.
So $5.9 million in rent a year, and it's back on market. So the point being, not everyone can at times survive if
Mm.
the risk is not assessed and analyzed as to what we are getting ourselves into. And it's not just about big people. Look, I'm doing developments at this stage. Um, Taking money out for developments means a lot. Every week, I'm looking at two developments. People bring their options on board. Or we can make $1 million in this on a spend of 7 million. And I said, that's not even 12, 13% return. Where are the risks covered? And then
Mm.
we realized there's no selling costs cover, there's no contingency anywhere, there's no margins kept for a developer to take
Yeah.
the money. And I said, are you planning to charge us or not? Where
Yeah.
is that bifurcation? So,
Yeah.
look, there's just a lot involved, and I think people get in, uh, they take risks, but at the cost of just losing their sleep, which doesn't make sense. I'd
Mm.
rather take less on board, but the right stuff on board.
Yeah.
And sorry, just we've digressed from the conversation, but that's where a lot of CBDs have changed. Um, and the suburban precinct and demands have gone up. Rather, the vacancies in the suburban precincts have actually literally dropped. But I still feel the regional precincts are a bit risky. But then, look, we're still a boutique agency. I don't see a volume that I have to really push through and go everywhere else to buy. I think
Yes.
we
Yeah.
secure some really good opportunities.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. I mean, the difference between resi commercial, the difference in the sweet spots and the types of things that we should be looking at, the difference in the lease and the diversification or the whales for some of these, $2 to $5 million properties. And it's good to get an up to date assessment of, okay, well, what's the flavor of the month at the moment. Before we finish up, is there anything else that you would like to impart for people that might be having a reasonable residential portfolio that are about to make their first jump, or perhaps they are commercial property investors that have invested at that lower price point and are looking for that next Goldilocks zone opportunity?
Um, Look, I definitely like the investors to walk away with certain things. Number one, don't go with the headline yields trap. The real question is how much vacancy risk you're taking to earn that extra 1 or 2%. Because those 6 to 12 months vacancies would ruin your cash flow pretty much for next 5 to 8 years.
Yep.
Um, when you're looking at due diligence, it's important to look at the leases, the full clause audits, the rent reviews, the make good clauses, the tenants and landlords' obligations, the break clauses and demolition clauses. An example, we bought an office space where the agent said the owner's happy to sign a lease, and before we purchased, they actually signed a lease which was slightly in favor of the landlord. And sometimes you're exposed to certain risks. And I also believe not a lot of investors understand what it takes to own a commercial property.
Mm-hmm.
So placing that trust in someone is important. Then looking at the tenants' arrears history as well, the financial statements if available, and the strength of bank guarantees and personal guarantees, which in a lot of cases would safeguard you on lease breaks. And all of this, definitely you need a solicitor. Don't go to conveyancers for commercial purchases. Even for resi, I'd rather would spend that extra $1,000 and look at
Yep.
solicitors more than anything else. Then building and compliance, really important. Structural reports, fire and safety certifications, accessibility with especially 9B building, so accessibility compliance, asbestos and environmental risks, because you might be onboarding a new tenant and the property, just to realize that the new tenant's business was not zoned for that precinct. And
Right.
you have ruined your, not just your experience, but also you might be liable to pay damages to the tenant because you've
Right.
onboarded someone else's risk. So
Yeah.
lastly, financials, the ongoing reconciliations, um, the service contracts, and the benchmarking rents against the market, which is checking the ongoing cap rate. Um, I've had an experience where there was a rental increase, which was a little bit beyond the market value, even though the location was really supreme. But then the property was sold at an ongoing cap rate. But we didn't realize that 1% change in rental sometimes add about $100,000 in cost.
Yep.
So then the risk analysis, which is your history of vacancy. So if it's a new tenant, how long the property was vacant before them, um, and how long is the lease? How many similar businesses are there, especially if it's a new lease in vicinity? There are some tools like I think Gap Maps, which tells you a little bit around development and the type of tenants. But these tools are really costly. Like it will be $10,000 to $12,000 a year.
Mm.
But then, yeah, looking at the whale, the tenant concentration, which I've already mentioned. So if you really have just 7 to 10 days, there's some of the non-negotiables that I would look at is the title and the zoning, just making sure everything's legal. There's no hidden encumbrances. The lease reviews, all of the tenants' lease reviews and expiry dates, and be very careful in calculating the whale based on the rent and the whale based on the area, and both at times gives you very different outlook.
Right.
Then tenant arrears is really important, which I've covered. Building and compliance, I've covered. Valuation benchmarks, I think pricing wise we haven't touched pricing at all, but
No.
also the benchmark, like is it under rented? If yes, why? It's under rented sometimes can be for wrong reasons. So look, these are, in a week you can't check everything, but if you can check these 5 things, and that'll pretty much make or break the deal. And if it does make the deal, you can safely proceed adding that due diligence clause, and which is a generic clause that we look at, um, and then go with that purchase. There's a lot of push at times that comes from the agent, very similar to residential, that you have to go with unconditional contracts.
Yep.
For commercial, I will never do that. I'll never do that. So now these are some things, and then again, on top of that, if further someone needs to check, I'd say hidden lease clauses, relocation, demolition clauses. This is important for tenants as well. There's a 5-year demolition clause generally, which I saw in one of the premises which I was trying to secure for an Indian cultural organization, whereby it's a very stable business, Mike. They can stay there for like 20 years and
Mm.
they will have a very, very loyal customer base. But with that demolition clause, the owner can give a notice of 6 months and make them move out anytime. Tenants walk away with a very massive reinstatement bill, which is your make good clause. It's a
Yep.
good thing to have even for the landlord. Over reliance on information memorandums, just take the face rent value without adjusting the incentive and effective rent,
Yes.
ignoring the downtime, not modeling a 6 to 12 month vacancy when the anchor tenant leaves. So, especially after 5 years, those sort of expenses. So, I'll always add, we never buy empty properties, understanding the GST implications. So even if 2 or 3 years lease is there or whale is there, I'll always tell them what happens if the anchor tenants leave or that one tenant leaves. Can you sustain for 6 to 12 months? If you can, it's a good idea to get in. And then assuming that all the outgoings would be recovered. Some leases could be gross, not rent. I bought a mixed use precinct as well, where there's a residence upstairs, a shop downstairs. I think it's a very safe sort of purchase. But then you have to understand the gross and the net effects of rent and what your outgoings would be, because otherwise the so in some cases the landlord will end up footing all the bills. So yeah,
Yep.
just most mistakes, I believe, come from believing the sales brochure instead of
Yeah.
interrogation on the leases and cash flows. So yeah, just you have to be very careful and cautious in commercial. If we've built a 27-point checklist in Resi, there's about 41-point checklist in commercial and growing, just as the
Yeah.
property level. So
There you
yeah.
go. I mean, that's a very, very detailed wrap up, and certainly helpful for people that have some idea what they're doing. For me, it just highlights the importance of hiring a professional more than ever, especially given the extra complexity in commercial rather than residential. So, Ashish, I'd just like to say thank you for that absolute knowledge bomb you've dropped on us there. There's a lot to it, but certainly some huge opportunities, as we've discussed in that Goldilocks zone for commercial property investors. So thanks for coming back on the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting, and I really like the opportunity you provide always as a business owner, and the support that you give in terms of depreciation schedules as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Checks in the mail, mate.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Amazing. Take care.